Wonderful. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Practical Strategies for Addressing the Data Gap for RT1 Women and Gender Diverse People session today. My name is Katie Allen, and I am a board member with the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, and I'm happy to be representing SURF today. We appreciate you coming to this space to contribute to our collective knowledge about the perspective of women and gender diverse people living in rural, remote, and northern communities. This webinar series is a direct outcome of the work that the Canadian Women's Foundation and SURF have been doing over the last 2 years. We held a series of knowledge sharing meetings between rural, remote, and northern situated folks and talked about challenges and opportunities and identified the data gap as an important topic of discussion, which brings us here today. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and the organizations supported by the Canadian Women's Foundation takes place on traditional First Nation, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, I would like to recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. In all that we do, we should make sure that we pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Canadian Women's Foundation YouTube channel. And if you haven't already, please click on the interpretation option and select a language at the bottom of your screen. We have interpreters working today to make sure everybody's words are translated. So please now select English or select French from the options to ensure a seamless experience for you. And if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. As with all online meetings, if we have technical issues, we will do our best to resolve them from the back end as quickly as possible. And finally, at the end of the webinar, there will be a survey available. Please take the time to give your feedback if you can. So it is my honor to now introduce to you Nona Matthews-Goss. Nona is the Executive Director of the Newfoundland Aboriginal Women's Network, an organization that strives to promote, enhance, and encourage the health, social, educational, economic, cultural, and political well-being of Aboriginal women within the island portion of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we've invited Nona here today to give the opening prayer for the session and the closing as well. We have offered Nona a tobacco tie ahead of today's meeting when asked for her assistance, and we are grateful for her presence today as we talk about issues facing rural, remote, and northern communities. Welcome, Nona. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll start with the prayer now. Dear Creator, thank you for this day and for this opportunity for us to come together to meet with the Canadian Women's Foundation, community organizations, grassroots organizations, and Indigenous government members to discuss the priorities in our communities and to help create a better place for our families, for our people, and for our community members to lead healthy and healing lives. And please provide us the encouragement amongst each other to speak freely and provide the opportunity to have our words heard to create a better world for all of us. Miigwech and miigwech.
Thank you very much, Nona, for the opening prayer. I will now turn the presentation over to our main speaker today, Jessica Duarte. Jessica has been connected with the Canadian Women's Foundation for many years in her capacity as program leader within economic development grant streams. She has extensive experience planning, implementing, and adapting programs in remote communities. And she is a very skilled web developer and has been lending her thoughts and advice during our rural, remote, and northern knowledge sharing sessions. Jessica is sharing her tech expertise with us today. So welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Before I move on to my slides and share, I'm just going to post a link to the slides in the chat for everyone if you want to follow along, but I will screen share at the same time. Okay, here we go. So yes, my name is Jessica Duarte. You can call me Jess. And I live in Whitby, Ontario, and it's the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Wendat. My pronouns are she and her, and I am really delighted to be here with all of you today. I'm very excited to hear what your thoughts are in the chat as we go through my presentation. So today I'm going to be speaking with you about how to narrow the data gap, and how really my focus is going to be the importance of asking the right questions when we're trying to gather data in our communities, especially in remote communities. As was already mentioned, I am a web developer. I've been running my own web development business for over 8 years. I'm a technology educator. I spent the last 4 years at the Long Lake 58 First Nation teaching Indigenous women digital skills. And I also spent years before that traveling the country and teaching code to children and adults. I'm a program manager of the CWF project at Long Lake 58. And I call myself a data dabbler, not a data scientist. So I just want to preface my presentation by saying that I am not a full-on data analyst and scientist, but I have, as a web developer, I have to analyze data often in relation to websites. And in the program management that I've done, I'm also working with data a lot. And so I've taken a number of different courses and read many resources on how to analyze data and how to work with it. But I am like all of you. I am a dabbler. If you don't consider yourself one, I hope you will become one after my presentation. But I'm fascinated by data, and it's a really interesting subject to me, and especially the data gap in northern remote communities, because I've seen it, and I want to continue working to make that, close that gap as much as we can. So today we're going to, first I'll tell you a little bit about the experience I had at Long Lake 58 First Nation through our digital skills program, and some of the data issues that we encountered there, and that really opened my mind to the data gap. And then I'll go through we're going to really delve more deeply into how to ask the right questions and talk about the data science process, ways to get data, and how to avoid biases. And hopefully we'll have a really good discussion about all these subjects. Because we don't have a lot of time, we can't delve deeply into everything. So at the end of my presentation, I have prepared a document full of some resources. There are thousands, but countless more, but some that I have used myself to learn about data that I'll share with you, and you can continue reading. So I went to Long Lake 58 First Nation in 2018, and I've been working with that community since then. And you can see here on the left a photo of the group of participants in our first year of our program, jumping with joy, because we had just finished the program. So we had around 25 participants the first year and the second year, and then the pandemic our program had to change a little bit. Primarily, the participants were women in their 20s and 30s. The program with the CWF is supposed to last for 4 years, and we're in our third year right now. And our goal has been to help women move forward on the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework. And that's really the overarching goal. And I'm only mentioning that because the data that I'm going to discuss was really about trying to figure out whether we achieve that goal or not. And that was the question that the program manager at Long Lake 58 First Nation and myself asked ourselves when we started the program, and we were asked this by the CW, the Canadian Women's Foundation, how were we going to measure the success of our program? So the Canadian Women's Foundation has an amazing program evaluation team that was super helpful and gave us a survey that we could use. But we quickly discovered that it was very long for our participants, several, over 25 questions. The reading level was a bit challenging. The participants told us that it was intrusive in some ways. They weren't comfortable answering a lot of the questions. They didn't see the value to them. The information was going off to another organization, and they didn't understand why they had to answer all those questions. And there was high abandonment. Even though some people participated in filling it out, they didn't fill it out entirely sometimes, or it was a burden for them. And the survey itself was not written with them at the table. And that was a major issue in the survey, that even though with good reason, the foundation had to create a survey that was more general for the entire group of organizations across the country that were participating, what our First Nation needed was a survey that was tailored to their needs and their particular experience. And so it lacked that specificity, and it just didn't feel like it reflected their true experience. So it couldn't really measure their success in that sense. And that was a huge problem. So the manager of our program started creating a new assessment tool that was based on the sustainability, on a sustainable livelihoods framework. And we wanted to make sure that, first of all, the tool was optional and confidential, and the other tool was also optional, but confidential in that we actually didn't need the students to give it to us, and we didn't consider it a survey for ourselves to gather data. It was more for them to measure their own success in the end. And so that for them was better because it was relevant to their own needs and their own success. We made sure that it was short, straightforward, the language was straightforward, it was relevant to their reality and what they were experiencing. It was written with input from them and from the First Nation, and it had a very simple scoring system, and the data was entirely owned by the participants because, as I said, they didn't even need to hand them in to us if they didn't want to. So it looked a little bit like this, and you can see here that they had, instead of multiple pages of complex multiple choice questions, they simply had to add a check mark next to these statements about feelings, subjective feelings that they had. And the idea was that they would do this at the beginning of the program and at the end, and then be able to self-assess whether they had really progressed or increased their overall score, and therefore moved up the sustainable livelihoods framework. So did our simplified survey answer all of our questions? Well, sort of no. I mean, it did help the people that did do the survey to assess their own improvements, but it didn't really help us be able to tell the Women's Foundation whether we had achieved our goals when we had to submit our final report. That wasn't really the tool that was going to give us the information that we needed. And so we had a data gap in that sense. And the survey really couldn't capture some of the important observations that we were making during the program, which were the huge achievements of the women during the program and the things that they accomplished through our projects, through the participation in the program, the interpersonal relationships that they were building amongst themselves, amongst each other in the group, and then the huge impact that we were seeing on the community through the program, because it wasn't just the women themselves that were participating in the program, but their children got involved, their spouses, their whole families, elders participated. And really it was more of a community effort, which is so common in First Nation communities. So it wasn't really about the individual. And so we realized that the way that we had to evaluate had to also account for these other data points, you could call, information. And so I want to pause here and ask you, when you think about where data is coming from in your own communities, and where data is being collected all the time, I want you to think, and just put it in the chat. Can you think of examples of when and where data about you is being collected on a regular basis. So not just surveys, but where in your regular life, day to day, is data being collected about you. So I'll look at the chat here. Oh, excellent suggestions here. Social media, medical, yes, excellent. Stores, anytime you touch your computer, yes, great point. Your cell phone, absolutely. Grocery shopping with points, yes, absolutely. Google, banking, when you sign up your children for activities, your phone, your internet, credit cards, research, cell phone, yes, internet history, Siri, observation, great one. Government, university research projects, yes. Webcams, smart TVs, Zoom, yes. All amazing answers. We have, as we all clearly can see, data is being gathered about us at all times, constantly with pretty much everything that we interact, especially when we interact with technology. But I'm really glad that observation came up in the answers, because that's another really important way that we can gather data. And I love this definition of data that I read, which is that just by being in the world and interacting with it using our 5 senses, we are collecting and processing data. And so when we realized at Longley 58 that we were seeing results of our program and achievements and markers of what we thought was success that we couldn't capture in data, we had to stop and think, well, what data is really available to us outside of a survey that students might answer or not answer. And so, of course, we had the observations that we were making ourselves, and those were so key, because the observations that we were making really helped us to define what the questions are that we should be asking. But we also then had some, more quantitative data, like the attendance and level of participation by the participants. We could look at the engagement of the participants' extended family and community in the program. We could try to look at the positive impact of student-led projects on the community, because we were doing a lot of community projects through our program. We could look at reported boosts in confidence from participants. So that was a thing that we were told a lot, that self-confidence, and we noticed that self-confidence was rising in the participants. The expressed pride in the work being done. We could look at some of the funds that how we were distributing our funds on food. So creating a safe space and providing food and community to the participants, the equipment that we were investing in to improve the quality of the program for them, and how much we were putting in experiences. That does also inform and help us determine what's causing success and what isn't. That's one possible metric. We also had social media running through in our program. We had a Facebook group that we communicated with, and we could post polls on there. We could interact. People posted questions and expressed thoughts on social media that we could have possibly also taken into account. And then, of course, there's also band office data. Our program ran through the welfare office, and welfare offices have a ton of government data for they're always filling out surveys to fulfill government requirements. And so there is a lot of data that is available, but of course that data is private and confidential, and it's not really accessible to our program. It is the welfare program's information, but the First Nation has the power of using that in an anonymous way without really singling out individuals' data. But they do have aggregate data as a community that could potentially be used to assess programs like this if they chose to. We didn't need to do that for our program, but that is data that is available there, but it's sometimes not used in that aggregate way. So there was a lot of data that was there outside of our survey. And that's the information that was more valuable for us in determining our success. Now, of course, the way that you gather data will determine how you analyze it. We're going to get into that. So not all of these, finding ways to analyze these points of information, it might be more complicated if they're more subjective and not necessarily quantitative, like there's no real numbers behind them. So I want to know from in your own communities, how are your organizations collecting data? And do you have data that you're collecting and not using? So go ahead and answer that in the chat if you'd like. Thank you, Sylvia. Working groups with collegial agencies, great. Post-event surveys, that's awesome. Registration from programs, great, that's a good one. Google Analytics, excellent. Client intake surveys, statistics on participants, surveys, interviews every 2 years, great. Client self-declare, HubSpot, organization collects data during client intake, confidential database, client intake. Yeah, there is a lot of data being collected here. Do you all use the data that you're collecting, or is there a lot of extra data that you haven't really had the time or resources to analyze and use? We report the data to government, but do not analyze on or use it ourselves. Okay. That's common. I have to report on 14 different grants throughout the year, so we use it frequently. Awesome. Okay. That's such an important point. And that, yeah, a lot of the data that communities are collecting sometimes is going to the government, but not being analyzed inside of the community, which is a real shame, because there's a lot that the community could gain from understanding that data more and asking questions and then using that data to answer those questions, because the questions will be different than what the government would potentially be asking. And that's what's so important that I'm going to talk about next. Just one moment, please. Alina, would you mind taking over for just 5 minutes? I just have an emergency. Yes. I apologize to everybody. For just one moment. I'll be right back.
Perfect, thanks. Just gonna spotlight myself here. Thanks, everyone. So Jess is just gonna pop off camera for a bit, but we luckily can keep this conversation going. And Jess's next question for everyone, and I think we can work through it together, is what comes first, the data or the questions? So what we want to talk about here is how oftentimes folks see the data science process as a direct line. You collect and then you use. You ask a question, you get answers, then you follow your next step. But that's not always the case. And Jessica's back.
Yes, I'll continue on. Thank you so much, Alina. I'm so sorry, everyone. I live with elderly parents and one of them needed immediate help. So yes, so I want to mention this. You know, we have data, we have a lot of data, we're all collecting data, and sometimes it goes off to other agencies that are analyzing it, and sometimes we don't have the resources to analyze it ourselves. And so I think one of the most important things that we have to think about when we're looking at data is the questions that we're asking and what comes first, the data or the questions. And sometimes we think that we have to ask the questions first and then the data comes, or sometimes we're just collecting data and don't really know what we're gonna get out of it, and we can develop questions after. And that's exactly right. That's really how the process works. So this is a graphic that I actually should have shown you earlier, but this is a really neat graphic that shows the amount of data being collected worldwide. And this is from 2017. So today it's much higher than this because it's growing exponentially every year. But in 2017, humanity, we generated more than 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. And if you click on this image, if you're on the slideshow yourself, you can go to the website where this was collected. And it's kind of overwhelming. I don't even know what 2.5 quintillion bytes is. I can't even understand that with my brain. So we have a lot of data. Oops, I clicked on it accidentally. So this is the traditional data science process. You ask a question, you get data to answer that question, you explore it, then you model the data, which is basically you come up with ways to correlate different points in the data, and you can train, if you're talking about algorithms and computers, you use the data to train algorithms that can then predict information for you afterwards. And it's fancy, and we don't have to get into it right now, but there's that part of the process. And then finally, you can communicate or visualize the data to tell your story about what you found in the data. But it's not linear. It doesn't always necessarily come with questions. Like you create a survey because someone thought about all the questions, your evaluators, and then you go and find that data and that's it. Sometimes you have to go back to the previous step. So in Long Lake 58, for example, we had this survey that was created for us by the foundation. We immediately thought, oh, it needs to be tailored to our community. So we changed the questions. But then even after using it and running the program, we realized, wait, there are all these observations. We're gathering data ourselves, the observations we're seeing in the community and the effects that the program is having that is not being captured anywhere. And so we have to go back and ask new questions and plan a new data gathering activity. So the data science project is never going to be linear, and it's not something that's static and stagnant. It has to be alive continuously, and you have to be thinking about the questions that you're asking and looking at the information and seeing whether you're missing something and you have to ask something else. Obviously, questions need to be, if you're evaluating things over time, your questions need to be somewhat standardized to be able to make comparisons over time. But you also need to make sure that you don't have gaps in your data and you're missing information that isn't being captured at all. So that's one of the exciting things for me about data, is that you are, at the end of the day, you're answering really important questions, and you can use them to tell compelling stories that can make a huge difference in what the work that you're doing. So these are the questions that came up along with 58 after our general observation. So after we did all the surveys and they weren't really cutting it. So we wanted to know, well, what are the learning environments that achieve the greatest results for our participants? Because we were tailoring our program to the women almost on a day-to-day, not a day-to-day basis, but it felt like it sometimes, because depending on who participated in the program, we had to change the supports, and we wanted to make a really safe environment. So whether that was childcare or providing food, providing a safe space for them to come whenever they wanted to, all kinds of things that we did to build, providing transportation in the morning. We had to sort of tailor things to the needs of each individual. And we were really realizing that different things that we did in our learning environment had an impact in participation and attendance and all kinds of things, as well as just general enjoyment in the program. Also, what obstacles are standing in the way of the success in the program? We determined, for example, in our first year, children really wanted to participate, but we had childcare provided, but the children wanted to actually learn what the parents were learning. They were really excited by it. So in our second year, we had to pivot and create a children's program for them as well to learn digital skills at the same time that their moms were learning digital skills. And that had a huge success, and it helped the women learn as well while their children were busy learning on their own. So that was something that wasn't captured in any survey that we sort of had to pivot at the time and do. And so that led to that other question, like what are these obstacles and how do we pivot around them? How do we determine success in the program? Is it how much classwork is completed? How many classes they attend? Or is it more about the confidence that they built? Is it about the relationships that they built, the recognition they receive from their community, how they felt, the impact on the community? The original goals that we might have had of teaching digital skills, maybe helping them find work, might actually not be as important as these other more life-changing things such as confidence building, but those were not necessarily in our original measures of success. So these were sort of the questions that we had that we realized we have no way of, we're not measuring them correctly, and we don't have a tool to do that. So let's talk about how we ask the right questions. So there are 4 types of questions that you can answer with data generally. You can use analytics, descriptive analytics, so you can ask questions such as what happened, so assess the situation. You can use diagnostic analytics, so ask things like why did something happen? What will happen is predictive analytics, and then what should we do is prescriptive analytics. So all of those types of questions can be answered with data, and they require different types of data and different types of analysis that usually you need experts to help you work on. But the questions that you're asking, even though you might need experts to actually do the analysis, the questions that you're asking should really be rooted in the community and should have feedback from the community and from the people on the ground running the program. Otherwise, they won't really be reflective of the needs and the reality of on the ground. And planning is key. So when we think about data, we're thinking about the questions that we want to answer, but we also should think long-term about all of the different steps. So you have questions, but from each question, you might have many sub-questions, and you have to really think through them and define them. We have to think about how we're going to gather the data. Will it be surveys? Will it be, focus groups? Someone mentioned focus groups, or post-event surveys, whatever it might be. We have to figure out, we have to have some idea of how we're going to do it, at least when we sit down to plan. How we're going to make sure that the data is unbiased. So making sure that people that are being surveyed are at the table when we're creating these tools. And how are we going to analyze them? How many data points will we need? At the end of the day, when you put data in a computer, the computer is going to look at correlations between different factors. So if I'm going to measure the success of some part of my program, how am I going to determine what led to the success? What other factors could have affected that success? And so if I have to look at other factors, I'm going to need other data points. Was it the childcare that led to higher participation? Was it the food that led to higher participation? Or was it the friendships that led to higher participation? Well, it could be all of them, but in order for me to know that, I have to measure the food, the childcare, and the friendships as well to be able to compare those things. So we have to really think about all of the data points that we might need. And also how we're going to visualize it, because your plan of how you're going to tell the story will inform the data that you need to gather as well to tell that story at the end. And the story might change. Like I'm not suggesting that you can plan from your question on and it'll be exactly that, because you also can't analyze data to fit your story. That would be biased as well. But having a plan and having an idea that you can change and it'll morph and it'll as you make discoveries, it'll definitely change, but it's going to guide you and help you be more successful in gathering your information. And most importantly, I cannot say this enough, involving the community or group that you're gathering data from is the most important thing. Otherwise, you risk having something that's too general or not, or you're going to miss factors and data points that are crucial to what you're trying to evaluate that you may not know about, especially if you're creating these tools outside of the community and you're not there yourself. So we've all talked about how we get data. You're all doing all of these things, so I don't really have to go into them too much. But these are some of the ways that data can be gathered. And there are more interesting ways that, such as storytelling. And for example, the Canadian Women's Foundation right now is using storytelling in our economic development programs to measure, well, to gather stories from the communities and the different programs across the country. And I think that will sort of give a lot of information about the success of the programs and the impact that they had across Canada through stories that are being told firsthand by the participants in the program. And it's the first time they're doing this, so I'm very excited to see what comes of it and what it teaches us about that impact. And then, of course, there are all these other fancier technology tools that you can use. I use web analytics a lot in my line of work because I build websites, and on a website, you can gather a lot of information about people's behavior on the website. So for a community, if you're using apps to interact with your participants or websites to interact with your participants, web analytics can give you a lot of insight into how they're using your product, what information they're interested in the most, whether your tool is easy to use or hard to use, how you can make information more accessible to them. All of that can be gathered in a very powerful way through web analytics. And then social media is extremely powerful, and companies that are using fancier data analysis software such as artificial intelligence and other things, they're using a lot of social media and web analytics to determine people's behaviors online, their desires, their likes, all of those 2.5 quintillion data points of information that were gathered by humanity are primarily being used by tech companies to then, of course, fundamentally make more money from us by making us buy more and serving us ads of what we might like, so that we buy more. And they do that with data. And usually it's this type of data that they're relying on. So, and then there's a ton of data available to the public that is out there. So Stats Canada has some data, but there are lots of databases available for research that can also be used, that could sometimes be helpful for our own programs. Usually they're used by researchers, but there is a lot out there that can be discovered and explored with, especially when you're exploring and figuring out questions. There's a lot of data out there that you can use for free that is public and available. Okay, so just trying to get a time check. How are we doing on time? My computer is not letting me see the time.
It's 1:43.
Okay, let's move it. Let's get going. Okay, so avoiding data gaps. So we can have biases in our analysis of our data. So the way, if you have a question, sometimes people will analyze the data, and as soon as they find data that confirms the answer that they want from their question, they stop analyzing. And then they're like, that's it, we got our answer, we're good. But that can create biases because there might have been other data they missed that contradicted that answer. And so you always want to make sure to do that thoroughly. But even before we even get into the analysis, the questions that we come up with themselves can be biased. And there can be gaps in the questions that we ask. And that's why we have to consult the people that we're asking the questions of. So an excellent example is a common assessment form from Ontario Social Services. These are questions from a form that are used for welfare clients in Ontario. And so these are some questions they ask them about the skills that they might have. And they get asked this like once a month or something like that. Frequently, they get asked these questions. I might be off by how often they get asked, but every so often they get asked these questions. And then through these questions, welfare administrators are supposed to determine what services can be offered to these people. So let's assume that these questions are being asked in a First Nations community. Can you think of anything that's missing if we're assessing skills and services? We're trying to assess services that people might need. what's missing, what could be missing if we're thinking about a First Nation? Can anyone think of anything? Broadband, internet, great one. Love that one. So Samantha says sometimes mainstream mental health supports are not helpful. Your personal safety, great. Connections to relatives and home communities, excellent. Cultural supports, yes. Questions regarding culturally appropriate services, excellent. Yes, awesome. Yeah, those are exactly, they're questions that are missing. And it's because these surveys are made for the whole province and they try to capture generally as much as, they try to capture the entire population in a more general way, but they're not specifically tailored to First Nations communities. And so they end up not being fully helpful to those communities because the person assessing on the front line, one-on-one, every single individual in the community that's using these services, they're missing gathering information about important markers that might actually be more useful than some of these general questions. So for example, they could ask about access and participation to community activities, which one of you brought up. Connection to elders might be a really important thing to ask about. Involvement in land-based programs, participation in traditional healing practices for mental health, for example. Access to traditional language education. These are just a few that I could think of, but there are so many other ones that you're all mentioning that are great. So that form is really quite inadequate and it does create a data gap because we're missing this information. And it's also not, it's biased in that this information is missing. And so it's biased to a more general population that doesn't think of the unique needs of the community that is being assessed. And so on a one-on-one basis, it has a huge impact on those individuals that are being assessed with these tools. So it's very important that we have the right information because when this information is put into computers, computers will look at correlations. So they're just looking at the numbers. Computers really are only as good as the information we feed them. Some people think computers are very smart. They're actually quite stupid. They're only as smart as the information we give them. We're the smart ones. The computers just do what we tell them. So they're looking for correlations and they're gonna look at all the data that we give them and then figure out patterns and connections between the data that we give them. So if we're missing information or if our information is biased because we're asking questions or we're putting too much or if the data is biased for different reasons, and I'll explain that in a second, it can have serious consequences and it can perpetuate systemic oppression. If you click on this link, it'll take you to a really interesting article on the analysis of software that is used in the United States to help judges create sentences for people that are accused of different crimes. And they use basically algorithms that tell the judges the likelihood using a score of that person being a criminal. But because the amount of, because the data is already biased and because in the United States, the majority of incarcerated people are predominantly Black and low income, that affects how the algorithm will determine whether someone is going to be likely a criminal or not. And so it can have huge implications for people because we're having a computer use data that is biased, come up with such a huge thing as a sentence, or helping a judge come up with a sentence. And that's because our data is sort of dirty in that sense. It's biased and it's not, it's been created with oppression built in. And so in the end, it's going to continue oppressing people. But it's not the computer's fault, it's our fault because we fed it all of this information that's already biased to begin with. And that's the problem when communities that are affected by the data and the software are not part of the creation of that software and the creation of the questions and the creation of how we're gathering that information in the first place. So it's quite an enlightening article, and I recommend it if you haven't read about this issue at all. It's really interesting. So once you have your data, you're going to have to clean it. That's really important. And for these kinds of things, I usually, since I am a data dabbler, I can do some of this work myself, and you can all learn to do this if you don't already, if you're not doing it on a day-to-day. And I'm talking about using spreadsheets, Excel, Google Sheets to organize your data, make sure it's clean and consistent. We can do all of this ourselves, but you can also work with professionals that will help you. Once you help them create the right questions, can help you clean and analyze data and visualize it and tell your story in the most compelling way. So that's the next step in our process. And when we visualize data, a lot of times we come up with these confusing graphs that are really intimidating and overwhelming and difficult to read. But nowadays, there's just so much amazing software that can help us tell really compelling stories. And even without software, even if you're using a pen and pencil, you can keep some rules front of mind. You want to keep your data really simple to understand. You want to use colors in an effective way so you're not confusing the brain or making the data even more scary to look at than a spreadsheet. You want to tell a compelling and interesting story, and you want to make sure that it's worth sharing. At the end of the day, you don't want to have charts just to impress a board or something. You want to have charts that are actually compelling and tell an interesting and important point. In my resources sheet at the end of my slide deck, I have a lot of really great books that I added on that talk about visualizing data, as well as some courses that you can take because it is an art form. You can have a whole career dedicated on visualizing data, and indeed it is a growing career path for people. It's really exciting. And I just wanted to share my favorite fun data visualization, which is just for fun. It's an analysis of the Beatles, and this was created with very popular software called Tableau. I would love to know if any of you use Tableau in the chat. Tableau is probably one of the most popular data analysis software right now out there. It's very powerful in creating interactive data visualizations. So here you can see who wrote the most songs. And so I can highlight the Beatles, and it shows me up above very clearly how many songs they each created every year. And I can go and highlight these, and it'll tell me McCartney peaked at 2 in the US in 1966. So it's very clear and kind of fun and exciting. They even show you the number of words in the songs, and it's just a bit of fun, but it's an excellent example of how data visualization can be really powerful. Now, is this important information that we should all have? I guess if you like the Beatles, it's not as compelling and important as your own data and your own programs. It's not going to change lives, but it's a really fun example of the power of these tools that you can use. And Tableau is something that you can learn, and it's a lot easier than learning to code, for example, to analyze data, which is much more complicated. So have fun exploring Tableau if you haven't heard of it or used it already. Yeah, and then the final thing that you're going to do with data, if you get into this, and this is what advanced companies and organizations are doing now, advanced technologically, I mean, is using data to predict. And this is what I wish we all had a lot more resources to get into in our organizations, because nowadays companies are using what's called machine learning or artificial intelligence to analyze data and predict the future, right? Predict what could happen down the line. And the way they do that is through, well, computers are doing it. They're not doing it. They're using math and algorithms to look at past data to see patterns, and then based on that, be able to figure out what could happen down the road. And so let's say, here's my example, if I have to determine funding for childcare in my program for the next 5 to 10 years, with machine learning, I could use data and a lot of correlating points potentially that I have on past participants, and I could give them to a computer, and the computer might be able to tell me if it can predict based on my past data, the amount of childcare that I might need down the road so that I can plan ahead for funding, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these are a lot more, doing this kind of thing requires more complex software and more expertise, so it's not as easily accessible, but it's becoming more accessible, and I think hopefully in the future we'll all be using these tools a lot more often and getting involved in AI as much as possible, because just like that prison software that I was mentioning, that court software, if we're not involved in AI and in machine learning and helping create the software, it'll always end up being oppressive and not really taking into account the communities that they affect. So it's super important that we all get involved and start even learning about this so that we can be at the table when these things are created, and also use it for our own benefit if we can. So yeah, and just very quickly, oh, it's 1:55. Is it still 1:55? I just wanted to touch very quickly on data security to say, I'm sure you all have your data very secure, but when you're getting into using software like Tableau, for example, the one that I showed you for the Beatles representation, they have cloud services. A lot of the data is on the cloud, and I know a lot of people are very scared of the cloud, at least some of my clients are, but there are lots of really amazing options for cloud services. A lot of my clients don't want their data in the US because they have different laws around security, but a lot of the software has European servers. So even if there's no Canadian server that you can use for some of these online services, there's usually a European server, and I recommend that you use them to put your data in Europe instead of the US because their security is much higher. So last but not least, please go to my little link here. I added a bunch of resources. Maybe I'll add some more this week, but they're information on books that I've gained a lot of knowledge from on data visualization, some articles that were relevant to my presentation, free online courses. There are many, many more. These are just a few. Paid courses if your organization has funding to send your staff to, and then software that is really popular now. These are really the key pieces of software people are using. So go ahead and continue your learning, and I hope you become a data dabbler with me if you're not already one, and it's been a pleasure. I wish we could discuss more. The Monday panel, I hope you'll all be there.
Wow. Thank you so much. What an incredibly informative presentation. Thank you very much, Jess. We appreciate your presentation, the knowledge that you shared, and the discussion today. Thank you. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please don't forget that the second part of this series is happening on Monday, and I believe the link is in the chat, Alina. If you'd like to get in touch further, please let us know in the post-event survey comment box. That would be wonderful. And now I would like to invite Nona to please share some closing words for today's session. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute, Nona.
Okay. I guess I'll start now. Dear creator, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and listen to Jessica Duarte and all the great work that she's been doing in her community along with her colleagues, and the information and knowledge that she provided to all of us that we are able to bring back to our organizations and communities and have guidance in our areas of collecting data and hopefully all becoming data dabblers. We want to thank the Canadian Women's Foundation for this opportunity. And also I'd like to ask you to please watch over those who are traveling home this day or to another destination, that they all arrive there safely. And please watch over the people who are hurt and struggling, that they will find comfort and strength. And miigwech and miigwech.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and thank you for joining us.